Yeah, I feel like this is a really big crush on free speech in UK and in Australia. We've seen quite a lot of suppression by the Chinese people when we're trying to promote a free Hong Kong, a democracy, free speech in Hong Kong. They're trying to silence us out by blackmailing us or threatening us or even coming to destroy the scene of protest events. And we're seeing the Chinese media, social media, or the national media trying to frame us as separatists. Yeah. How would you say on this? Would this be a really big threat to free speech in Australia? Would this make people scared of coming out to protest against the government, against dictatorship?
Oh, well, certainly. The first consideration is the impact on Hong Kong people in Australia, Hong Kongers in Australia, because what it means is that the full weight of the Chinese security state now operates or will soon operate in Hong Kong itself. And that means if you're a student in Australia and you want to merely state that you believe that Hong Kong should have democracy, then you are seriously threatened. You know, your parents could be punished, your brother could be harassed, all kinds of things could happen to your family. And it probably means that you are in severe danger when you go home to Hong Kong. But it also increases the danger for anyone in Australia who speaks out against the CCP, because now it is much more dangerous to go to Hong Kong, whereas previously it was safer for people like me, for example, to go to Hong Kong than to go to the mainland China. There's no way I would go to Hong Kong now. And so that means that anyone who goes to Hong Kong, they go as if they're going to Shanghai or Kunming or anywhere else. And that means they are subject to the security apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party, and they are therefore in danger unless they toe the line. So that affects free speech in Australia. It means if you ever want to go to China and Hong Kong, do not say anything critical of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, because recently we've seen the national security law has been passed in Hong Kong, which has been enforced on July the 1st. This has been applied to Hong Kong citizens in overseas countries, such as like people like us, and even foreigners like you. Are you threatened by this? Like, would you see this as a really huge threat to free speech? Like, even though you, as an Australian, you might be being prosecuted by this law, which is totally absurd.
Well, it is totally absurd, and it means that, you know, in the eyes of China's laws, I've been probably committing a serious offence by talking to you today.
Yep.
Yeah.
And therefore,
I'm
not to mention you, of course. You know, when I say this, it's, you know, I have more protections than you do, of course. But even so, you know, the thought that, well, I've just been committing a crime under Chinese law, and that Chinese legal authorities, not to mention the sinister arms of the security state, may have therefore targeted me, is in itself worrying. You know, someone like me says, well, I can't set foot on Chinese territory, which now includes Hong Kong, without a very great risk of being arrested and thrown, you know, incarcerated, and with everything that then might follow, which is a horrible, horrible thought. So I guess, you know, it ups the ante. It says that if you are an Australian who's never said anything critical of the CCP, now the danger of making the decision to say something critical of the CCP in public, that has increased as a result of this security law. And so that affects free speech in Australia to that extent. That's for kind of mainstream people like me. For people from China and for people from Hong Kong, or for people from Hong Kong, obviously it hugely increases the impact on their capacity to speak freely in Australia and participate in the democratic process.
Because what's really concerning is that even in China, the human rights is really bad. Like you see the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or the Tibetans or what's happening in Hong Kong. They put millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps. And we've seen police brutality, what's happening to the Hong Kong people trying to take the streets to protest against the government to fight for democracy and freedom of speech. And there's nothing we could do in Hong Kong. Would you say this is a really concerning matter? Like this ideology is trying to spread through to the world, trying to justify what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing in China. Are you really concerned about this matter of the spread of this ideology?
Oh, absolutely. Hong Kong itself and the introduction of the security law and the effective abolition of the rights that Hong Kongers enjoyed since the handover and before is a really serious assault on democracy and demonstrates just how ruthless the Chinese Communist Party can be in extending its power everywhere. And it certainly makes Taiwan's situation look a bit more precarious because it's an extension of Beijing's kind of ruthless power to Hong Kong, and that makes Taiwan feel more nervous. Beyond so-called Greater China, I don't think we should use that term, but nevertheless, we have seen, obviously Beijing can't assert its influence in the same kind of way that it has done in Hong Kong, but nevertheless it is using a whole range of influence and interference techniques to try to undermine resistance to it from within, particularly by targeting elites in business and politics to turn them into friends of Beijing.
Yeah, so actually, just now we've mentioned about the national security law in Hong Kong. It got really force passed despite the objection of the Five Eye countries and many other powerful countries. So, what would you think about this force passing act of the attitude of the CCP?
Well, I think it shows the great increasing arrogance of the CCP, the conviction amongst the top Chinese leaders that China is now powerful enough to start throwing its weight around. And of course, it decided to use the opportunity provided by the COVID-19 pandemic and the preoccupation of countries around the world to crack down on Hong Kong with the imposition of its security law. So I think it tells us a lot about how the leadership of the CCP has shifted to a far more aggressive stance globally. And so that's certainly, on the one hand, something that we really need to worry about, but it also means that many people around the world are starting to understand the true nature of the regime.
Would you say that we're entering another Cold War? Because what we've seen is that regarding the national security law in Hong Kong, there have been some countries that are really supportive of the law, such as North Korea, Syria, or Cuba, such those dictatorship or authoritarian governments. And some countries, like the Western countries, like the US, the UK, European countries, and Australia, has been really vocal about opposing this law in Hong Kong. Would you think that this is dividing the world into two extreme systems opposing each other?
Or maybe a start of a world war again?
Well, the CCP has always seen itself as being involved in the Cold War never ended for the CCP. After 1989, I mean, actually, it resolved, watching the collapse of the Soviet Union, it resolved to in a way, intensify the Cold War in the sense of reaffirming the party's control, controlling ideas, controlling understanding of history within China, and since then it's become more and more paranoid about the infiltration of Western ideas, which is what the Cold War was about in one sense. And so we do see an emerging battle of ideas. Some people say the CCP isn't interested in exporting ideology. This is completely untrue. It's just doing it in a different way. So in that sense, there is a continuation of the old Cold War, and part of it has been, with its increasing economic power, Beijing essentially buying off allies around the world and using them to set up a kind of pro-Beijing bloc.
Right. Before we end this interview, do you have anything you would like to say to the people of Hong Kong who is fighting for free speech and democracy?
I think the people in Hong Kong who've been fighting very strongly for freedom and democracy are kind of a beacon of light for the 21st century, because here are people who've become used to having a whole range of freedoms, universal freedoms, and some kind of participation in democracy, which is going to be taken away from them by a ruthless authoritarian power. And they've resisted very strongly. And we've all watched on, with our holding our breath, hoping that people of Hong Kong can prevail. It seems at this point today that this ruthless dictatorship has decided to come down very hard, and it looks a kind of as if that light for freedom and democracy is going to be extinguished. And this is a great tragedy, not just for the people of Hong Kong, but for the people of the world. And so how this will now unfold, it's hard to say, but there's no question that the people in Hong Kong who have fought so hard to retain their rights and their participation in a form of democracy, at least that was agreed, they have enormous support around the world, enormous support and sympathy, because in a way they're fighting for us all, because you're at the front lines against this tyranny from Beijing, and it threatens us all. So more power to those in Hong Kong who want to stand up for basic human rights.
Thank you so much, Clive, for joining us for this interview. I hope you all the best with your book released in Nordic countries and elsewhere around the world.